So what are we here to talk about? We're here to talk about narrative writing. And if you go to Mrs. Thomas's 5th grade class, or if you go to the Iowa Writers Workshop and you ask the question, what is a narrative? This is probably the answer you're going to get. Very useful. We're done. Thank you for coming. Was this a useful workshop? There will be an evaluation form. Oh, you want more? Okay. All right. So how about this? You need a main character. You need a setting. You need a problem, some conflict, an obstacle. It should be interesting. Now there's a challenge. It should be significant or an entertaining activity. I particularly love that phrase in this definition. Okay, are we done now? I guess not. Okay. So here's a little checklist. You should have some, if you want to do a narrative, you need characters, right? And they need to be characterized. By the way, I'm going to make this PowerPoint available to everybody, so don't feel like you have to take notes. And it's not that good anyway. So you want, some scenes, right? What's going on around the characters you created? You might have some dialogue, including internal dialogue, right? Not just what people are saying to each other, but also what people are thinking to themselves. Of course, telling detail. The one I love always is the curtain flapping in the wind. So, you can reach for themes, right? Maybe there's a larger theme in your story that isn't spoken, that you don't directly address, right? Maybe it's a story of loss, or maybe it's a story of redemption. And then, writer's voice, right? Somehow you might want to come through in this piece somehow, so the reader gets a little sense of not just the story you're telling, but who you are. But you might, now that you've got this checklist, you might have some trouble. Well, what does this actually look like when I sit down in front of that blank screen or that blank piece of paper? And if you're like me, you might want to think visually, right? So, luckily, if you go on the internet, there are literally thousands of story diagrams and ways of thinking about stories. This guy on the left here, this guy Gabriel Willinghans, has a Pinterest thing that has literally hundreds of story diagrams. So now we've got our checklist, but now we have a picture, so we're really set, right? This is going to be easy now, because what we're going to do is we're going to sit down in front of our piece of paper and we're going to pull this baby out, and we're just going to fill the words into each of those boxes, right? We got our situation, what's the desire, we got our complication and the obstacle, we got our solution outcome, story's done. Right? Thank you for coming. Are we done now? Not yet? Okay. Well, maybe this one will be more helpful to you. If you're more into curves, you can think about this one, perhaps. I don't know, some people aren't into curves, so maybe you're into angles. So maybe you want to use this as your little map to creating your story. Of course, you will shoot yourself at the end of using this. And then, because we're here about science, I had to show the research, right? So this is an actual research paper in a peer-reviewed journal, which claims to show the 6 plots which are present in all stories. Now, if you look carefully, you may have trouble separating number 3 from some of the others from like number 5, because those are both labeled rise, fall, rise. So how you separate those 2 plots is a little beyond me, but you know what? I would just ignore this. So to get us started, I'm going to show a little clip from Kurt Vonnegut. Some of you may have seen it. Kurt Vonnegut was quite a famous novelist, and he did a master's thesis back in the late 40s and 50s at the University of Chicago. He was actually an anthropology student, and he got interested in what are the origin stories of cultures all over the world? How do they tell their origin story? What are the fables they tell? What are the stories they tell about themselves? And what he realized is if you study all these stories, they boil down into a number of narrative arcs. And so we are going to hear him discuss this a little bit.
Startling eccentricity and universal appeal. His singular view of the world applies not just to his stories and characters, but to some of his theories as well.
Well, there's no reason why the simple shapes of stories can't be fed into computers. They are beautiful shapes. This is the GI axis, good fortune, ill fortune. Sickness and poverty down here, wealth and boisterous good health up there. Here's the very middle. Now this is the BE axis. B stands for beginning. E stands for electricity. Now this is an exercise in relativity, really. The shape of the curves are what matters and not their origins. So we'll start a little above average. Is why get a depressing person? We'll start. The whole thing, we call this story Man in Hole, but it needn't be about a man, and it needn't be about somebody getting into a hole. But it's just a good way to remember it. Somebody gets into trouble, gets out of it again. People love that story. They never get sick of it. All right, not copyrighted. Another story, also a beautiful curve and easily fed into a computer, called Boy Gets Girl, but it needn't be that. Just a way to remember it. Start on an average day, average person, not expecting anything to happen a day like any other. Find something wonderful, just loves it. Oh, God damn it. Got it back again. People like that. Now, these are beautiful curves, and this gets a little complicated. Computers can now play chess, so I don't know why they can't digest this very difficult curve I'm going to draw for you now. And it so happens that this is the most popular story in our civilization, Western civilization. As we love to hear this story, every time it's retold, somebody makes another $1 million. You're welcome to do it. Now, surprisingly enough, I'd say it's depressing. You know, people don't like stories below average days and people. But we're going to start way down here. Worse than that, who is so low? It's a little girl. What's happened? Her mother has died. Her father has remarried a vile-tempered, ugly woman with two nasty daughters, big daughters. You've heard it. See? Anyway, there's a party at the palace that night. She can't go. She has to help everybody else get ready. She has to stay home. Now, does she sink lower? No. She's a staunch little girl, and she has had the maximum whack from fate, which is the loss of her mother. She can't go any lower than that. Okay, so the fairy godmother comes. Gives her shoes, gives her stocking, gives her mascara. Gives her means of transportation. Goes to the party. Dances with the prince, has a swell time. Boring, 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 boring. Now, there's a slight inclination to that line as I've drawn it because it takes perhaps 20 seconds, 30 seconds for her grandfather clock to strike 12. Does she wind up at the same level? Of course not. She will remember that dance for the rest of her life. Now, she poops along on this level till the prince comes to shoe fits. She achieves off-scale happiness.
So, what is the point of that? The point of that is structure is important, right? So I suspect over the next 2 days we're going to be spending a lot of time, we're going to spend a lot of time talking about structure, because in the end, what underlies all narrative stories is some kind of structure. And so the nice thing about it is you can borrow a lot of these structures and apply them in lots of different ways. You know, it's a little like music. Everybody gets the same 8 notes, right? But some people end up being Mozart and some people end up being Bon Jovi. So people who are known for narrative writing really get into structures, and they really get into visualizing structures. So John McPhee, who you may know, wrote for many, many years for the New Yorker, taught at Princeton. His book about story structure is sitting out on the table out there. What's it called, Liz? Step 4 or something like that. But John, who I was lucky enough to have a number of times to hang out with, he would draw these little drawings of his stories as he worked on them. And they are completely inscrutable to anybody except him. But the point is, he was always thinking about structure, and he says, structure has preoccupied me with every project. So one last word about narrative and structure and so forth. This is Dan Baum. He's a longtime freelancer. He's been around a long time. About 10 years ago, he had this amazing tweet storm where he told the story of his time at the New Yorker as a staff writer. Now, if you're not aware, staff writer is the rather Orwellian term that the New Yorker uses to describe freelancers who are on a contract who have no benefits and no health insurance. So basically, it's what everybody else calls a freelancer, they call a staff writer. So he was talking to his editor one day about all his stories, and he had this one story he was working on, and he was proposing a way he was going to do it, and this is what the editor said to him. So, but he did also have this to say. So with that sort of brush with the reality of major magazine narrative writing, I am going to turn it over to my esteemed colleagues who will take it from here.
All right, thanks everybody for coming. We're on, right? Yeah. So I've been the health science and environment editor at the Washington Post for about 3 years now. And when I was applying for the job, you have to do this sort of tricky task of saying what's good and what isn't, what you can improve on. And one of the things I talked about was our Medical Mysteries series. Has anybody read these? I mean, the Post runs them, the Times Magazine has, a lot of places do medical mysteries. And as I was interviewing for the job, I said, well, they're really great, but they're kind of formulaic. And I got the job anyhow. And once I got the job, I got access to our traffic numbers. These stories are incredibly popular. Everybody reads them. People love them. And one of the things I realized was formulas are great. Like, formulas are your friend. People enjoy formulas. There's formulas for a reason, which is that they work, and people enjoy them. And my other big insight was, boy, I really do still have a lot to learn, which I think all of you too. Like, no matter how long you've been in this business, there's a lot we can learn, and we can learn from each other. So I'm really glad to be part of this workshop. So the medical mystery formula is, of course, a mystery. And so it's, you know, mysteries are like some of the best-selling genre fiction. And so anybody want to just, does anybody enjoy reading mysteries, detective stories? Yeah, I love them. That's like my pleasure reading. And so what are the elements that are like crucial for a mystery story? Just shout out what you think. Dead body, yeah. Something really bad. Something terrible happens. Yeah,
Something a secret.
Yeah, something secret. Yeah, something's mysterious.
Parties with competing interests.
Yes.
Clues.
There's clues, exactly.
Something that fundamentally doesn't make sense.
Something doesn't make sense. Yeah.
An investigator?
And there's an investigator, yeah. So a lot of science stories like tick all those boxes. Something is weird. There's competing theories. There's evidence that gets accumulated, and some, genius scientist figures out what the actual answer is, and there's a resolution at the end. And that's one of the pleasures of mysteries, is that you know the answer at the end, which in life you so rarely do. So that's whenever there's a medical mystery, like, people just love that. Or when as you're doing your work, whenever you recognize in science that there's an answer to a question, often a mystery structure is a really good way to tell the story. And that's rare. A lot of times in science, our stories end with, and more research is needed. But even if you can sort of artificially say, and then the answer was this, and have some sort of resolution at the end, that's just super satisfying. David mentioned the whole beginning, middle, and end thing, and it's really hard to find an end to science stories, so that's one of the big challenges. And in mysteries, usually there is an end, so just seize that if you can. And some of the other genres that are super popular are horror. Can anybody think of a science or science-y storybook, anything that you read that is basically fundamentally a horror story?
Hot Zone.
The Hot Zone. The hot zone.
Anything with like the really drastic, like super volcanoes, sort of.
The big one. Exactly.
Did you give them all $20, Laura?
That's good. These are great. I got nothing to teach you. So yeah, exactly. And when this came out, there were so many science writers, and myself among them as a science editor, I'm like, there have been a dozen stories about this. We've all published or thought about stories or read stories about this. Everybody knew this, but what Catherine Schultz did differently is turn it into a horror story. And so that's, and also, being in the New Yorker makes a big difference, and having lots of space and all these other great storytelling techniques she used that made her story stand out and get attention when all the other news reporting and feature stories that had been published about this before, just people didn't, it was still a surprise to a lot of people, even though we'd been doing our jobs on this for a long time. So, and because she used the conventions of horror, it just made this story a lot more popular and relatable for a bigger audience. And then true crime, I can even think of the sorts of stories we might cover that have crime elements to them. Don't mean to put you all on the spot.
Deuter Staple.
What's that?
Deuter Staple or other scientific frauds.
Scientific fraud, yes.
Oh, yeah.
So this is basically, and the thing about true crime is you start it with somebody, you either do or don't know at the beginning that somebody is doing something bad. Sometimes there's a twist halfway through and you realize that the nice guy next door is actually a serial killer. Sometimes you start with the crime. So the actual structure of the story is a little bit different, but the sort of tone of somebody who seems to not be a criminal doing criminal things, or alleged, he wasn't actually, I have to be careful with my words here. Don't sue me, Brian Wanzig. But he did, he twisted data in ways that are contrary to the standards of science. And then other things like obituary. So this is not a human, but has anybody read an obituary lately for somebody who is not a human? Opportunity. And a lot of the stories about opportunity did start with the word obituary, and ours did too. And related to that is a eulogy, so they're a little bit different, but these are, and the obits pages of newspapers are very popular because it's a really interesting time to kind of take a look back. And again, this is one of the stories that has an end. Opportunities, the dust storm and the wind didn't blow the dust off of its panels, so it lost power. So the nice thing about an obituary in a way is it's a full life. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. The end doesn't have to be spectacular. Ideally somebody dies at an old age of just old age. And Opportunity had a great run, so it was just a nice way to take a look back and talk about all the things that Opportunity had accomplished. And so it doesn't have to be like a literal dead person. And that's always a good time if there's somebody in your field who's been really important, who dies unexpectedly or not. That's a good opportunity to sort of tell the story of them and their research. It's basically a profile, but a little bit different. And usually, since they're dead, you can't talk to them. So you're talking to all the people who they've had an impact on. But it's basically a structured profile with outsiders where the person's gone. So that has certain implications for the tone and the structure and what your sources are and what you can say about them. And then a eulogy is related, and it tends to be a little bit more of an appreciation and less, it doesn't require the chronology quite as much. And it tends to be more anecdote driven, more telling anecdotes. What are the things this person did that were super memorable? What is the impact that person had on others? And we had one in the Post. I had nothing to do with it. One of our style writers wrote about the oldest spider in the world. And it was this really kind of charming, touching thing. And Neiman Storyboard did an interview with him about how he did this. But it was just taking what could have been a short news story about the oldest spider, which is interesting because who knew spiders could live to be 40 years old? But he turned it into a eulogy, and it was very popular.
By the way, if you don't know about Neiman's Sports Storyboard and you're interested in narrative, you should go check it out. They have huge narrative resources at Neiman. They used to run a narrative journalism workshop at Harvard every year, so they have tons and tons of stuff.
Yeah, great resource. And memoir, first person, these stories tend to be really popular because it's such a treat to sort of experience the world through somebody else's first person. This is what happened to me. This is what it meant to me. As writers, it's we tend to have boring lives for the most part, so probably we're not going to write our own memoirs, but sometimes you can. And the Open Notebook actually has a series reminding, because I just blanked on the name, Diverse Voices, yeah, where people write about what it's like to be a science writer in our community. And so I think this was the first one, right? Yeah, so this is really nice. It's a person who's on the autism spectrum talking about what that's like and what it's like to be a journalist. And she has a lot of insights for all of us about how we can be doing our jobs better, for editors, how to work with people with autism, how to seek out writers with autism. So it's another genre that, you know, we won't have that many opportunities to write in it, but you know, especially if something interesting happens to you. I hope it doesn't. It's usually bad when something interesting happens to you, but I'm kind of like the ghoul of the newsroom. If somebody has like a distressing disease, I'll often express sympathy and then say, well, you know, would you like to write a first person about your experience? And then history stories, you know, the conventions of history are basically, you know, for the most part chronological, but the emphasis is on what else was happening in the world. How does this stuff you're writing about fit in to what else is happening in the world? Who are the important players? And ultimately, the point of history is to sort of understand our current world better. And a lot of times, you know, and this is, I think you obviously get better at writing history stories as you have more experience and you can make connections and remember that, you know, the genetic modification arguments we're having now harken back to things that happened, you know, in the 1970s, and what was that about? And so, you know, you can basically make it a feature of your experience, of the fact that, you know, if you ever feel like I've been covering the same story for 100 years, you can basically use that to write a history take about how we got here and what, you know, what really mattered back then, what were the misperceptions back then, what was it like to be in that world back then. And so this is a story I published from a writer about the Clean Water Act, and, you know, why, you know, how rivers burning in Cleveland led to this act. It's one of the most important things in environmental law, and what Cleveland is like now. So that was a nice story. But, you know, this is by a historian, but any of us can do it too. Consider, you know, if you're a reporter for long enough, you're also a historian. Don't tell the historians I said that. And then profile, obviously this is a really good genre for science writing. Especially if you read it, it really relies on having a main character who's interesting and distinctive and quirky and cooperative, who's, you know, willing to do it. So it's not for every story, but if you find yourself interviewing somebody who makes you laugh or makes you think, you know, that might be the way to tell the story. It's not always obvious at first, but you can always, you know, incorporate elements of profile writing into your stories, even if it's not fundamentally a profile. And the New York Times does, I hate to say it, but they do a really nice job with this. So they have a whole series called Profiles in Science, and this is the landing page. So if you're ever thinking about doing a profile and just want to get a little inspiration, you can just kind of skim through this and, you know, find a headline that grabs you and kind of look at how they structured it, how they did it. And then, you know, this is a little bit narrative, but I'm going to just run through quickly some other ways to tell stories that readers love and that can help you structure your own ideas. And so I did one a while ago about disturbing scientific discoveries. And it's basically chronological, like it starts, I should look more closely. Yeah, it starts with the idea that the world is round, and that the Earth is the center of the universe, and evolution, obviously, age of the Earth, all these things that we now sort of are taught in school. But when they were first discovered, were really profoundly disturbing to people. And the inspiration for it was that I was working at Smithsonian Magazine at the time, and whenever we ran a story about evolution, like, people would freak out. We get a lot of letters from creationists who were really upset about it. And so it's like still fresh to them. And so I kind of went through the history of all the things that had been disturbing and why people objected and what the concerns were. And so there's a little bit of a historical narrative, but it uses the list format. And of course, lists are something that magazines have been publishing for, you know, ever since there have been magazines, and people love them because you always want to know what is the 9th thing, what is the 11th thing, could I guess, how many could I guess? So people just click like crazy on list stories. Other things that are fun to do, like how-to guides, games, do-it-yourself, choose-your-own-adventure. Christy Ashwaubenon had a really nice story about key hacking. And you could do it yourself. You could, you know, identify, you could basically play scientist and play with the data and find spurious correlations all over the place. And it showed you like how easy that is to do, but each little iteration of the game was also a little bit of a narrative where you're like picking your own theories. And then Twitter threads are an emerging genre of excellent writing. Vicki Stein had a nice one about maps. She interviewed Betsy Mason, who has a book out on maps and the history of maps. And so this thread is sort of making an argument about why maps are still important and talking about the history of maps. And the Twitter threads work really well when there are images you can intersperse. And she, and it's also, because you keep adding to it, like it keeps popping up in people's timelines, and if there's any, if it's happening in real time, people keep clicking, and you can tell it's a real thread when the first responses are people eating popcorn, little gifs of people eating popcorn. So it's a good way to kind of keep people engaged and keep them going. Comics, you can tell a story with comics. This is a story about bee mimics. It starts out with the 100 millionth annual meeting of the Bee Club, and over the course of the comic, it talks about all the different bee mimics, and so the club keeps getting smaller and smaller until there's no bee club. And so it's a way of talking about all the bee mimics that's also a comic narrative. So obviously, like some of you do comics, I know. Most of us don't, but you can always team up with an artist if you have an idea for a comic, and it's whether or not it turns out well, it's kind of a fun way to kick your own thinking. And then there's just all these other ways, just to kind of keep in mind that it doesn't have to be a 5,000 word narrative to be a really interesting narrative, which can sometimes, or a 1,500 word story or a 500 word news story. Like there's just a lot of different ways to tell a story, and kind of experimenting with these, or just remembering that these exist, can kind of help you kick you out of your own thoughts and your own patterns and things like that.
So my topic is the secrets to reporting a narrative story. And here's the first secret. I am not a science writer, but I do write about science. And what I've learned is whether I'm writing about particle accelerators or gout, the best way for me to tell a story is through people. The more abstract the topic, the better it is to get a person, a concrete sort of person, to tell it. I also think, I don't know if any of you read in the Times how to handle a teenage girl's like meltdowns. This woman was describing, it's abstract, the concept of a meltdown. And so she interviewed another doctor who used something called the glitter jar. And when a girl in the high school was, crying and sobbing hysterically, she shook the glitter jar. And she said, this is what's going on in your brain right now. Let's wait for the glitter to settle. And I thought that was a really clever way to put something concrete into a model. And so I think about that when I'm trying to tell a story, particularly one that I don't understand at all. So for me and for you, that means it's important to hone your skills as an interviewer. So what I want to know is how many of you are comfortable talking to total strangers and asking them questions, especially you're comfortable. That's good. Most people are not, especially when you're speaking to an expert on like quantum physics and have no idea, which has happened to me plenty.
That is different from an average stranger.
Well, it's hard, to go in cold. I hate picking up a telephone, to do a phone interview. I dread it. I don't know why, but I read that Joan Didion did as well, so it made me feel better. But it's difficult to do. But the good news is the more you do it, the better you get. And it's a reality for someone like me, who likes to write about people. I'm so curious about everybody. But it's difficult to walk into a situation where you know nothing on the topic and you have to become an expert pretty quickly. So when I was writing about the professor who was building a cyclotron with his students, I went and watched, and I remember asking some of the students to remind me what the difference between a proton and an electron, and they just rolled their eyes at me. But the truth is, I made it as far as AP biology, which was a struggle, and You know, that doesn't stop me from pursuing stories that I find interesting because the people are interesting. Everyone is interesting, and so my job as a writer is to figure out, you know, what makes them interesting and how do I tell that story to a reader. The interview can draw that out. So I wanted to talk about sort of how to go into an interview, what to do before, during, and after. So, first of all, I'm going to ask you, and I ask this to my students a lot, what's the point of an interview? I didn't need to interview anybody. It's easy. To gather information, right? You're gathering information about the person or the subject that you're talking about. For me, it's everything. You know, I usually say, you know, speak to me like I'm stupid. You know, it's everything needed. Or to figure out who else you need to talk to. You know, you're talking to a person, but maybe they have somebody else to recommend. So it's a way to sort of build your list or even your characters in the story. In order to do this, you have to figure out how to break down the barriers. Because when you go into an interview, especially in person, it's artificial. You know, you have to sort of figure out how to find some sort of commonality, some sort of rapport in a very artificial room. It's not always easy. So, and you also have to remember that you have an agenda, the information that you need to get, but so does that person. You know, usually they also want to get something across. And so it's hard to sort of break through that. But again, you know, the good news is the more you do it, the better you get. So the 3 steps in the interview process is before, what sort of things that you do before, which, anybody want to help me? What do you do before you walk into an interview with somebody or pick up the phone? Yeah, how do you do that? How do you prepare? Whether questions or just sort of, or the topic, right? Yep. That counts, yes. Yeah, you read articles they may have written, you interview other people who may know them. You know, you want to go in secure enough, you know, that you know enough, at least to launch the first question. So prepare a list of questions. Sometimes I hear my editor's voice in my head. Like, I know she's going to ask me how old the person is. You know, I know she's going to ask me what they majored in school. Just very easy, you know, sort of softball, but have it down. And then, you know, talk to people in the field who might know that person. You know, all the stuff that you can prepare ahead of time, Googling, you know, reading. And then once you get there, and I always suggest going in person. You know, sometimes I know it's difficult, but if you're writing a profile or you think that you want to tell this story through a star, your person, it's so much better to go and meet them. I like to meet them in their office where they work, because not only are you going to have them be more relaxed and more comfortable on their turf, but you can notice details in their office. What do they have on their bulletin board? You know, what kind of coat is hanging behind the door? Do they have photographs of their family on their desk or something else? All of that, and it goes to what David was speaking about, using the elements of fiction, you know, the kind of like the theme and character development, the quirks. I mean, all that stuff you can get by physically being there with the person. And if not, we also talked about recreating scenes, is if you can't get to that person, asking the questions, memory sort of questions. You know, what do you remember when you first, whatever, what did it look like? What do you remember feeling? You know, all that can help recreate a scene that you may not be able to actually report on. So, and it's also asking memory questions is a really good way to loosen somebody up. You know, everybody likes to kind of talk about, what do you remember about your chemistry teacher? When I wrote about this physicist, I talked to his parents. What was he like as a kid? What was his favorite toy? It said so much about the man who I was profiling. I remember the parent said his favorite toy was a bag full of extension cords. You know, that it not only humanized the guy, but I got it, I got it. And so I found that really helpful, talking to people who are even not in the field, related, a wife, I think the more you can interview people, the better prepared you are to sit down and write. So I want to talk about now the different kinds of questions that you can ask, because there's the biographical kind of questions, which are the obvious ones, but there's also different kinds of ways to ask a question once you figure out, is this person you're talking to a brick wall? Is this person a one-word answer person? So how do you get around that? Do you have the people who are comfortable interviewing? Do you have techniques for talking to a brick wall? What do you do?
Describe X.
Yeah. What else? What other ways can you combat somebody who gives you the yes or no's? Yeah.
Usually I ask, like, is there anything that surprised you in your research, or is there anything that's
Yeah, you're pointing your
shocking
finger.
to you?
Yeah. You have to try and get them to tell a story. If you ask yes, no, and the person is not a talkative person, you're gonna get yes or no. So to ask them to tell a story, whether it's tell me about the most surprising thing that happened, they're forced to talk to you. They're really forced to talk to you. And it's difficult. Some people are just not comfortable speaking, especially to a journalist. We get a bad rap sometimes. But making them feel comfortable and also being very interested in what they're doing. I find that somebody who gets to talk about what they do all day long is enough to get them going. That's enough in a way. And sometimes when that happens, they talk and talk and talk and talk. And has that happened to you? You're shaking your head. What do you do? I mean, that's another problem. Talking to a brick wall, or somebody who just gets really excited about their topic and doesn't stop talking. What do you do?
It depends on where they're going with it. If they're going into lots of technical detail, then I try to steer them back to sort of the bigger picture. Same if they're just rambling about like unrelated stuff, that's but if it's something where I feel like they're going towards something but they're not quite there yet, I let them keep talking. Because a lot of times they'll get the best quote at the end of that long ramble.
Right, yeah. And sometimes too, if I know I'm not gonna be using the rambling stuff, I write, so they think I don't record, I actually write longhand in a notebook. I use that time to notice details. I watch the person. Do they look me in the eye? One person I interviewed kind of drew out what he was saying. One person, he was a coder and he did this. So as he was talking, I noticed, because those are all the personal quirks and details that make that figure come alive. So if they're talking and talking, look and see what shoes do they have on, or anything that you can do, and allow that person to a certain point to just go on, because you can still use that time. I think you're raising your hand. Yes.
Yeah, I was gonna say one trick that I use, and I feel like it is a trick, because I use it in situations where people are brick walls, or where they just keep going on and on and on. It's a little unfair, but sometimes what I'll say is, either, okay, this is really interesting, but, and then I basically bring out the reader and I say, but our readers may not be able to pick up on this part. Can you describe it in a way that they could? Or similarly, when they're rambling on and on and on, I might also invoke the reader and say, oh gosh, this is so fascinating, but I'm thinking maybe this is what our readers are going to be more interested in, and try to divert them that way.
Yeah, I call that the parking lot.
Okay.
When that's the parking lot. I'll say, I don't invoke the reader, that's a good one. I'll say, this is really interesting and I want to get back to it. But before then I have to finish, can I ask you some of the questions that I, have prepared? Or, I always say something like that. okay, I like this. Because I feel like when you're interviewing somebody, they don't know the story you're after. Maybe you don't even, but they think they do. So they're pushing their own agenda, or they're trying to help you. And it may not have anything to do with what you're writing about, but they need to talk, you know? So sometimes you let them talk, but there's always the parking lot. I just say, you know, let's park that over there and I'll get back to it. And sometimes they just forget and you never have to. But yeah, so another question is, depending on who you're interviewing, whether you start with the easy questions and build up to the kind of tough ones, the controversial things you may want to ask, or if you get that over with first. How do you decide? That's something to consider when you sit down with somebody. Do you start slow and then get them comfortable before you hit them, or do you get it over with because you're so nervous about it? There's two theories of thought here. What do most of you do?
I like the starting gently, simply because if it goes bad, when I start off asking them about their recent indictment, I may never get to what they were like in high school.
Right.
But I can see the argument going the other way.
And how do you broach a topic that's uncomfortable, but that you know you have to ask about? How do you frame that?
I've never done it particularly well, though in theory, in my fantasy world, I try to imagine I am a neutral, elderly Viennese guy with a pipe saying, now let's talk about something or other. Let's talk about that little incident at the border with the incarceration. Tell me how you feel about that. And I never can't do it. I just don't fight me.
So my sort of visual of that is asking a short, direct question and then just being quiet and nodding your head. Because the more you do that, the more they'll talk. Some people feel like, you know, especially if you're encouraging, they'll keep going. So that's one technique to use. I get my husband all the time on this. If I need to find out something, I just keep doing, and he just keeps going. So, you know, it works when you do that. Just ask a direct question, you know, instead of beating. I tend to beat around the bush when I'm uncomfortable, but if you just ask a direct question, look at your notebook. Sometimes I'll say, you know, I know that you may be uncomfortable answering this, but my editor really, you know, my editor's gonna ask me this anyway, you know, blame it on somebody else. But I still find, you know, if you say, and Janet Malcolm, I don't know if you have read The Journalist and the Murderer. The first time I wrote a story where I thought the characters in the story were gonna be mad at me, you know, and I felt like I was betraying them, she said, read this. And I've never forgotten reading, you can get it it's a very short, slim book. But she, basically, she says, you know, writers are always betraying somebody. But also, if you tell your subject, I'm writing a negative story about you, or I'm writing a glowing, flattering piece, they're gonna tell you the same thing. You know, they're gonna tell you the same thing. And I've learned that myself. I've told people I am writing about the mean world of the antique dealers. And they all talked smack about each other, not realizing that they were part of that world. And that's why I use a notebook I write, so they can see I'm writing down what they say. You know, that's what I prefer to do. But they said exactly the same thing. You know, it really played out. And a lot of times, that's one of the dangers in an interview too. When you ask a question and they say something in response and you know they're not gonna look good. You know, that's a huge challenge in the interview process, especially when they're comfortable, when you get somebody comfortable, and you draw things out of people. Then you have to decide. I always have, you know, a crisis of conscience, like, I need to put this in here. You know, I need to put this in here as a journalist, knowing that when you encounter yourself on the page, if the person's reading about themselves, it can be earth-shattering, you know, and you do feel like you're betraying somebody, but you have to be, you just have to be true to your job and the story, and that can be hard, you know, when you do create that rapport in an interview. When people are trusting you with their story, it can be very difficult, but I think it's, you know, it's also a sign of a really good interviewer to be able to do that. So I think you had mentioned sometimes the best quotes come, you know what, so I call that the notebook ploy. So this is another reason why I take notes in a notebook. I say, okay, and then I put my finger in the notebook and close it, and that's when all the good stuff comes out, you know, and I'll say, oh, that's so good, do you mind if I just want to take that down. It works, I don't know why. I think, you know, they forget, oh yeah, I want to tell you, or they become so relaxed that
They let you take right down it, do their
I'll open it back up, you know, I'll say, oh, that's so good, do you mind if I take that down? Because also I think if you're closing the notebook, they're like, it's over. You know, people, you know, there's nothing more flattering than someone to say, I'm really interested in what you do, tell me about it. People really like to talk about themselves. They really do, especially people who are working, you know, in a cubby alone, you know, with their computer. That somebody is interested in what they're doing and wants to share that with a larger audience is very flattering. So I think that does work to kind of get somebody to keep talking. The other opposite of that is when they say this is off the record. Have you ever had anybody do that? What do you say? What do you do? That happens a lot. Mostly what I've learned is the stuff they say is off the record is nothing I would ever use anyway. It's not that interesting. So how do you handle that? Do you at the beginning of your interview, do you say everything's on the record, or do you kind of counteract when they say it?
I think people have a right to be on the record, right? So,
A right to be on the record?
A right to say, like, I don't want you to use this in the interview. And then I find that afterwards, if I do want to use it or refer to it, I'll contact them again later and say, so I just wanted to kind of mention this thing. Can I do it like that? You know, if I do it without mentioning this other thing, is that okay? Or like, I kind of negotiate afterwards.
What happens if they say all this good stuff and then they say, oh, but that's off the record? Which happens all the time because they don't hear what's coming out of their mouth until it's out of the mouth, and then they think, oh, what do you do in that situation?
I respect their right. I will ask, can I use this non-attributed if it's on factual stuff that isn't unique to a person?
Mm-hmm.
And as full respect for it, they say no, I'll try to get that same page from somebody else.
Mm-hmm. That's a good troubleshooting, to get it from somebody else if you need it. What do other people do? Yeah?
I have kind of conflicted feelings about this because in my imaginary world, I'm a journalist who might someday go and be doing some hard-hitting story that involves wrongdoing, and I'm doing investigative stuff, and then absolutely, if someone says it, I'm gonna stick with the technical on the record. If they say it after the fact, it's on the record, it's going in there.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, in actuality, every time that's happened, it's just been like some poor researcher who is doing their best to be accurate and said something that's that could get them in trouble with their colleagues or something, or might sound politically incorrect or something. And I'm like, I don't, maybe it would make for a more exciting story if I put this juicy stuff in, but it's not worth actually getting this person in trouble, and I don't want to make enemies in this field. So
Right.
I can't, there has never actually been a time when someone has done that to me when I haven't honored it.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's all about your intent too. I mean, if it's your intent to write a hit piece, you're going to want to say all those, incorrect things. But sometimes, it does show a lot of their character. it's a decision. It's really difficult. You know, I don't have the answers. You know, I think about, do I really need this quote in my piece? There was one, I'll tell a quick story. I was writing about, this is not science, these lady bloggers who would go out at night and just go to parties and blog about them, and like that was their job. And it was really fascinating, because how do you have a job just going to parties and taking pictures and posting them on your blog the next day? So I followed a bunch of them, and I asked one of them, and I asked her a few different times just to make sure, which is another strategy. If they say something that you know might get them in trouble, I'll say, can you rephrase that, or can you tell me again? Because then they sometimes correct themselves. But this woman, I said, how do you decide on which party to go to? If you're invited to 5 a night, how do you decide? And she said, well, who cares about some like Joe Schmo at a cancer thing? And I thought, it went in, it went out, it went in, it went out. And I ultimately I left it in, because it did say something about her. And she said a lot worse to me, like way worse. And I didn't put any of that in. You know, that was sort of it. But sometimes it's helpful when the person digs their own grave. You know, I think that's what's really important when you interview somebody too, is you let them do it. You don't need to editorialize. They're just gonna do it. And so a lot of the stories I write, I let them talk. And if I'm concerned, I'll say, you know, can you say that again? Or I'm not sure I got that. You had your hand up.
I also think that if you are gonna do, you know, an interview where you think the person may say something controversial, it pays off to start off by saying, okay, this is an interview, I'm a journalist, I'm taking down everything you say. You know, if you want to go off the record at any point, we'll talk about it. And then that way, I think that they realize that it's not just something they can retroactively do.
Right.
Yeah.
Because a couple of people here have said, you know, that's their right. It's really not.
It's not.
They're talking to a journalist.
Yeah, Laura and I were shifting uncomfortably in our chairs and hearing that. Just to be clear, because so if you want to and are planning to write for major newsrooms in this country at least, the expectation always is, from the moment the source opens their mouth, they are on the record.
Yeah.
And now, if you want to set the ground rules early, and because maybe the person is naive, that is great, right? You can say, I just want you to understand, we're on the record as I talk to you. You know, if you do want to say something that's off the record, you need to be clear that that is going to be off the record, and I need to agree to that. Off the record is a two-way agreement. It is not one person saying this is off the record, and then and if you want a great example of this, Bill Booth, who I think still works at the Washington Post, used to cover California politics at a time when the Republican Party was savaging each other, and he had a long verbatim quote in one of his stories where the head of the California Republican Party savaged their own gubernatorial candidate, and then at the end of 3 paragraphs of just savaging the guy goes, of course, that's off the record, end quote, comma, getting no assent from the reporter.
I think for most of us, or me at least, the person you're interviewing is not used to being interviewed, you know, and it really does come up, and I'm glad that we're all talking about it, because, you know, you're human. I feel, I have a personal, I feel bad. I know that person doesn't realize it, you know, sometimes you don't realize what you sound like. You know, I've been interviewed before, and when I read quotes, I don't even remember saying it. You know, I'm sure I did, but it puts me in an uncomfortable situation. But I do say, I need, you know, this is on the record. You see me writing everything down. You can't really prepare. I mean, I don't know what's going to come out of somebody's mouth sometimes, but I sure know when it sounds bad for them. You know, but you're there to tell your story too. I mean, as a writer, and again, it is about your intentions. You know, if you are, you can tell the story without, you know, I don't know. I mean, this woman, she just said so much stuff about short and tight and my dress. You know, I didn't need to continue with the quotes. I chose what I thought described her as a person and as a character, but you know, I could have been a lot worse. And in fact, my editor at the Post, this was Beth Chang, she wanted me to. She really, really wanted me to, because I was telling her stories about, my nights out, and I said, I can't. I've done enough. I've done enough, and it was a terrible feeling, because I knew this woman was going to be just devastated when she read the piece, and she was. But she said all those things, and I had my notes, but I'm sensitive. Writers are sensitive people.
One nuance is you can negotiate with the source beforehand to say, if they really don't want to talk to you, you can say, well, how about, listen, can we talk on what's called on background? Which means we're going to talk, I'm going to use everything you tell me to inform myself, but I'm not going to quote you unless I come back to you and we negotiate what I want to use from the conversation. That will often take a reluctant source off the precipice, get them to talk to you, and the more comfortable they get with you, then you can negotiate what you want to use from the conversation.
But again, they can't do that after the fact.
Exactly.
That's just
No, you can say, I've said, but then it's like background, and then someone will say, well, this is deep background. Okay, yeah.
This is double secret handshake
Exactly,
background.
I know. Okay, but yeah, it does. I'll say I'm just using this, will you talk to me on background, will you tell me, and then they're more comfortable and more easy to convince. That was so good. That's what I always say, oh my gosh, that was so good what you just said, please, can I use it, But yeah, people, I feel like you're in control of the interview, but sometimes someone else wants to be in control of the interview, and you always have to be the one in charge. And if you're meek and shy, it can be more difficult, or if you're up against somebody, it can be more difficult. Yeah.
I think it's always difficult. I mean, I'm not meek and shy, and I find it really hard
To interview people.
Yeah, to ask really hard questions.
Yeah.
And then to have them want to take back what they've said. I mean, I think that you do have to ask yourself, is this really in service of my story, or am I just sort of trying to get a sexy quote? I mean, and then I also think that what's helped me when doing that kind of reporting is that I have to think about my main duties are to the facts and to my readers, not to make my source like me.
Right. Yeah.
I want everyone to like me, and that's part of my issue, right? But that's really not what my job is. So.
Yeah.
But why don't we come back to
Okay.
the
Right,
on
I still
that
have
can be
after. I know there's
yeah.
so much to talk about. So all right, so now you're done with all that. You've handled the person or people. After you interview somebody is just as important. It's maybe one of the most important steps. So review your notes. I sit down and review them, and whether you transcribe them or highlight, it depends what I'm doing. But I review them because reading them again may make you remember something else, or a detail, or oh yeah, I forgot that person did that. Sit with them and add to them. I usually underline the best quotes that I know I'm going to use. The tone, get their tone of voice if you're not tape recording. Just all the things you remember. Just do like a sensual data dump down there so you don't forget. Especially if you don't have time to capture them in the interview. If this person's talking and talking, you may not be able to look around. So try and remember. I've started to take photos. I'll say, can I take a picture of this thing that I don't know what it is? So I can look at it later and then figure out how to describe it. That's a really good tool that somebody else did and I stole. I had never thought of taking a picture with my phone and bringing it home. I've done that a lot, and it helps a lot with what they're wearing. The more details, the better. So that's my piece. Unless anyone has any other after tips, that's what I do.
All right. Yeah, so what I want to talk about is how you figure out if your story has narrative potential. It might be a situation where you're considering doing a story and you haven't gotten started and you'd like to approach it as a narrative and you're evaluating whether that's going to work. It might be a situation where you have halfway or nearly fully reported a story and you think, I think I can do some great narrative in here, and you're trying to figure out if that's true, and if so, what more do you need? either way, you have to figure out whether your story has narrative potential. You're trying to spot a narrative thread. Just like that. Oops. So David alluded to some of these things earlier. What makes a narrative? There are two things. One is the story has to have a point, right? There has to be some central driving question or idea that is the reason that anyone would want to read this story. If your story is about a guy sits down and has breakfast, and breakfast ends, and he goes to work, and there's no point to that story at all, then you don't have a narrative, you have a chronology of things that happened. So thinking about, in this story that I'm thinking of telling, what is the central driving point of it? The other is that, as David said, that the story needs to have a character, it needs to have scenes, and it needs to have action. Of course, the character drives the scenes and the action. Of course, there can be stories with lots of characters, and sometimes the character isn't even a human being. Maggie Kurth Baker just won an award for this great story about Pan, the panda that was, as the headline of the story went at 538, was really, really good at sex. And in that story, the central character was a panda. It was not a human being. There were lots of human beings in the story, but the protagonist was this panda. So in a narrative, the needs and desires of a character propel the story forward. Those are shown through a series of scenes that contain actions. I want to stop and say, because it's really easy to start to feel like to have a narrative, it has to be a Pulitzer-worthy New Yorker story or a book, and it has to be a complete and true narrative that is worth spending 10 years on, like Henrietta Lacks. That is not the case. There are many ways to use narrative in smaller ways that can really enrich our stories, and I'll come back to that. But just to say that narrative is not an all or nothing thing. And in fact, science stories seldom have a true narrative through line. So as you're thinking about your own stories that you're working on, it can be easy to feel discouraged, like we're talking about these examples, whether it's Henrietta Lacks or whether it's the really big one or whatever the story is, and they seem like these really complete narratives. I think it's really important to think in terms of narrative elements and not in terms of narrative as one end-all be-all thing. That central driving question that I mentioned, it is sometimes unstated. Sometimes the reader may not even be aware consciously that this is the central driving question of the story, but it's still there. It has to be there. It has to be an engine for the story. It's something that's guiding you in your reporting. It's guiding you in your crafting of your lead and your nut graph, and you're thinking about how to structure your story, having an understanding of what is that central driving question. So some examples of central driving questions could be, and these are a handful of dozens of possible central driving questions. Who is this person? You're doing a profile or you're doing another piece, and the point of it is for readers to understand, who is this person? Or what was that like? What was that time like? Or what was that experience like? What was that place like? What is that place like that I'm never going to go? Why did that thing happen? How does this process work? How does this lab experiment work? How does this process in nature work? How does this thing work? Will this person's wild idea be successful? Will this person or this species or this ecosystem survive? And if so, how will they survive? What are we figuring is going to be the future for that person or that species? And I see some people taking pictures of the screen. I'm happy to share the slides later. And if that person or species or ecosystem actually is doomed, then there's another interesting question, which is how will it face its known death? So those are just half a dozen examples of central driving questions. They sort of relate to these ideas of story archetypes and big themes, but you want to have that idea in your head of what's the question I'm addressing or the idea that I'm advancing in this story. Character. I think character, usually people, but not always people, is the biggest key to narrative. They have wants and needs. They're what drive the story, and they're revealed through their actions. That can be their gestures, it can be their language, it can be choices that they make, it can be in dialogue. They're revealed through their relationships with others. They're revealed through physical characteristics. But the reason I put relevant in red here is that it can be really tempting to just kind of do a data dump of physical characteristics that you wrote down or you took a picture of when you were doing an interview, and they're not relevant and they don't reveal anything about that character as it relates at least to the theme of your story. They might be totally relevant in another story, but you know, it's really easy to say this person has brown hair, glasses, is wearing a blue dress, and that does not tell you anything. You know, you may or may not have a little bit more of a visual picture of the person as a result of that, but you haven't learned anything about the person or about what their motivations are in this story. And so thinking about physical characteristics, most often I think that when they are relevant is when they're revealed in some kind of an action. So, you know, maybe it's a physical characteristic that this person has, you know, she has super long hair down to her knees. That's a physical characteristic that's noteworthy about her, you know, noticeable about her, may or may not be relevant. But when she is about to, you know, get under the hood, she does something to her hair that, you know, just really reveals the way that she gets down to business in her work or something like that. That actually sounds kind of lame, but but there's an action that's taking place here where you're saying something about a physical characteristic, but it has relevance to the story that you're telling somehow. And then finally, what people call status markers can reveal character. What kind of car does this person drive? What does the jacket that they have hanging on the back of their office door look like? When you said that, Cathy, I was thinking about when I was in grad school, one of my professors was Peter Salovey, who was a psychologist, and now he's the president of Yale University. But back then, he was a professor who was, I think, chair of the department and kind of moving up the administrative ladder. And he was kind of famously messy. And he did a television interview one day, and he was wearing a pretty nice looking jacket, but at some point in this interview, he opened up this jacket, and the lining was just shredded. And it was just like a really revealing physical characteristic and sort of a status marker. He had a, you know, professorial corduroy jacket with patches on it or whatever, and he looked reasonably put together for this interview, but then when you saw the inside of his jacket, you saw something else about him. That's just a story that his wife told. I haven't read that in a story, but to me that would be the kind of moment in a story where it's a physical characteristic, it's a status marker, and it tells you something about the person as a character. A story that I wanted to mention just to give an example of the way that character can be revealed through actions and through scene setting is this story was published in the Washington Post magazine in 2012. Brian Bostag, who used to be a reporter at the Post, wrote it. And I just loved this story. We did an interview with Brian for the Open Notebook about it, and I think about it often. Tireless Tracker rewrote the book on dinosaurs in Maryland. It's about this guy named Ray Stanford, who is, maybe some of you are familiar with him, is renowned for his ability to spot dinosaur footprints. And Brian got onto this story. I think it was just going to be a daily story. He had identified one particular dinosaur footprint, and then once Brian met him and talked to him, he said he came back to his editor and said, "I got to do a bigger story on this guy." And so he did. And so he wrote this feature, and I really loved the lead of it. And I've just highlighted in the lead elements that are what I'm getting at when I'm talking about revealing character through action and through scene setting. I'll read it aloud because I know it's a little small on the screen here. With the coiled energy of a stalking cat, Ray Stanford splashes out of the stream and onto a rocky sandbar, his knee-high hunter green boots leaving shallow heel prints that fill with water and begin to melt. Crouched, Stanford scans, head down, wavy silver hair dappled in the sunshine. Birds tweet, water rustles. It's 3:30 p.m. The sun is at mid-angle, throwing good shadows. Stanford picks up a flat slice of pale yellow rock, a rough triangle the size of his hand. He rubs it with his thumb, tilts it this way and that. "You see that?" he asks. A splayed mark etches the rock's surface. It looks like a little three-toed dinosaur was here. I love this, and all these red bits are, the coiled energy, these splashes, and he's wearing the knee-high hunter green boots, and these are things that reveal something about how he lives his life and how he dresses, and that his wavy silver hair is blowing in the breeze, and then he rubs this thing, and he's just by picking it up and rubbing it and turning it this way and that, he's figured out that this was a little three-toed dinosaur. And you just have this little character profile in a paragraph. So that is an example of revealing character through action in a scene. Questions that you can ask yourself about potential characters when you're looking at a story. Who has the most at stake in this story? People who have the most at stake are often a great lead character because there's some kind of source of tension and conflict or complication that they're trying to resolve. What is their central need or want as it relates to this story? They might have a lot of needs and wants in their lives that are irrelevant to your story, so you are going to be filtering some of that out and just thinking about what is motivating this character in my story, what's relevant here. What actions does that character take that will drive the story? And are they a compelling and relatable character? Some people say they have to be a sympathetic character, and maybe it depends on how you define sympathetic. I was talking about this recently with Jackie Vanashinsky, who runs Neiman Storyboard, and I had taken a workshop from her, which I highly recommend, her narrative workshop. And she does not use the term sympathetic. She thinks that suggests that they have to be nice people who you like. And I guess I agree with her that that is not the case, that you can have a compelling character who is relatable. You can, in reading this story, you can fathom what motivates them. Even if you think that they're horrible people or you disagree or they're not nice or whatever, they are relatable as characters. So a reader can follow this story from their perspective even if they don't like them. And then I have a note here saying, regular people are motivated too. And I think sometimes we can feel like, I don't have a character unless they're really wacky, or unless they're just, really unusual, or they have like some kind of physical presence that is amazing to behold. They're the kind of person who walks into a room and everything stops. And I remember one time editing a story where the lead character was like a guy who wears Dockers, and he has kind of a regular haircut that's a medium color of light brown, and he wears regular glasses that aren't noteworthy, and he just doesn't really do anything that seems all that compelling, and so you could feel like, there's not a very good character because he's just not striking. But in fact, he's got a really interesting project going on, and he's got questions and he's got motivations, and he's a good character, and it doesn't, you don't have to be wacky or wild or really seem to be really unusual to be a good character. So as one of the regular people of the world, I guess I just identify with the idea that you can still be an interesting, motivated character. The right character to drive your story is not always the one that you would think. And this is, I worked on a story when I was an editor at Discover. One of the first stories that I got there was this story by Liza Gross that I loved. And this story was kind of like the crucible on which I learned how to do narrative editing. And it was a story that ultimately was called Face of Hope in the magazine. And as I say, it was by Liza Gross. She did a beautiful, beautiful job on it, and worked on it through many drafts and won awards for it, and it was really great. And it's about the phenomenon of research in facial reconstruction, and particularly reconstructive medicine that's necessitated for people who have horrific facial injuries as a result of IED blasts. And she got onto this story when she learned about this guy, Todd Nelson, who was this wounded veteran who had been horrifically injured and had been through dozens of surgeries, and his face would never be the same, and he had an extremely moving, compelling story, and seemed like a natural character for this story. The other competing character, other kind of competing protagonist in this story is Robert Hale, who was an Army doctor who first treated him and who saw him through this reconstructive process, and who, through meeting Todd Nelson, was inspired to develop a whole area of multiple areas of new research through the Army, so that other soldiers could benefit from medical advances that had not been available to Todd Nelson. And so Liza and I were working on this story, and reading about Todd Nelson would just bring you to tears. And we had drafts of this story where Todd Nelson was the lead character, and those were very compelling parts to read, but the story just wasn't working right. And what we finally figured out was that this is a story about the science. This is for Discover magazine. It's about this medical science. And the character who we needed to make the protagonist for our story was Robert Hale, the doctor. It was not Todd Nelson, which is not to say that Todd Nelson didn't remain a big part of that story. He was sort of the inspiration for Robert Hale, and he was a big part of the story. But Robert Hale was the protagonist. So I'll just illustrate again with a paragraph or so from the start of this story. And the little thing seems so little. I don't know how many hours I stewed over how to make this happen, and Liza stewed over this to make this happen. But it was to start the story by saying, by Colonel Robert Hale's count, Todd Nelson had already cheated death twice when he arrived at Brooke Army Medical Center in San Antonio. A 34-year-old senior logistics supervisor based in Kabul in Afghanistan, Staff Sergeant Nelson had escaped injury on hundreds of convoys by relying on speed, agility, and a little luck. On a hot August day in 2007, a month before he was due to go home, his luck ran out. And then there's about 2 paragraphs that describe this event in which he was so badly injured, and then we come to Hale again. When Hale, one of the Army's top facial trauma surgeons, first saw Nelson still clinging to life, he also saw the young man's future. Hale knew that even if his patient survived, no doctor could fully restore what was lost in Afghanistan, the face that Nelson and his friends and loved ones knew as Todd. And so Hale becomes the hero of this story. He drives the story. It's his search for these medical advances that drive the story. Nelson comes in and out of the story at various points, and he's important, but he's not the protagonist. So my point is that your main character is not necessarily the person who might first seem like the obvious main character in a narrative. I talked a little bit about scenic action, just to come back to that and think about what are the questions that you can ask yourself when you're reporting a narrative story, or when you're thinking about whether you do have a narrative story. What are key scenes that you can witness or that you can reconstruct for this story? How do they relate to that central driving question? What action takes place in those scenes? How will that action move the story forward? What will your scenes reveal about your character or characters? And what sensory details will convey the appropriate information and mood for the story? So light, sound, smell, taste, the sense of the space, all of those things are sensory details that you want to make sure you hoover up in your reporting, and you will not write them all down in your story necessarily, but when you're reporting, as Cathy says, you just want to get everything. You want to have notebooks full of all kinds of details that God knows what you're going to use, but you just want to make sure you get them. And those are things that it's going to be hard to get later. You can go back and reread a study and get information later, but sensory details are things that you want to try to record as much as you can while you're doing the reporting. This is a story that Nidhi Subaraman wrote for BuzzFeed News a couple years ago. I really loved it. The tribe that's suing the U.S. government to keep its promises. It's about people on the Rosebud Indian Reservation who have been really let down by the Indian Health Service and have terrible health care and are suing the government to try to get health care services that are in fact legally mandated, but they're not getting them. And this woman, Cathy Boyd, and I'm so sorry I didn't put the photographer credit on this, but Christina Barker is the name of the woman who took this photograph for BuzzFeed News, and she sold it we published it at the Open Notebook, and she let us use it. And this woman, Cathy Boyd, is the lead character in Nidhi's story. And her story starts off describing, and this is another scene setting example, one April evening last year, Cathy Boyd stepped onto her deck and lit a cigarette, as she often did after dinner. She loved the quiet and majesty of the nearby forest, even if it was remote and cell towers were too far away to service her house. but that evening she didn't linger to watch the sun dipping behind the pine and cedar trees. Her heart was going berserk. And then the story goes on to describe this heart attack that she was having and how she'd barely made it, and she was really ill-served at the local hospital and at the next hospital, and she's part of this lawsuit. In this lead, Nidhi does a lot of work. First of all, she's describing the scene where Kathy Boyd lives, and things like, even if it was remote and cell towers were too far away to service her house, of course, that you can imagine that has implications for the story, right? But the quiet and majesty of the nearby forest, and that she loved this place, and the pine and cedar trees, and just her stepping out onto her deck to smoke a cigarette as she often did after dinner. These details give you a little bit of a hint about her and her life and her place in the world, and how that place in the world is going to relate to the theme of this story. So that is a really hardworking lead paragraph, and it kind of speaks to this idea that you want to know what your central driving point is, because that is going to help you shape that paragraph. Another example, did any of you guys read this story in Audubon, Can the Ivory-billed Woodpecker Be Found in Cuba? That was the funnest story I read all that year. Go and read it. I really loved it. It's by Mac McClellan. It's in Audubon in 2016. She was, I forget if she won or if she was nominated for a National Magazine Award for it. Really, really fun story. She goes to Cuba, and she's with these researchers who are searching for the almost certainly extinct ivory-billed woodpecker. Laura would know if it's truly extinct. It's truly extinct, and they know it's extinct, and you as a reader know it's extinct. But these researchers are going to Cuba, to this remote corner of Cuba, to look for it, and Mac goes with them. And they have all these scenes like this with this, all hands on deck pushing this Jeep out of the mud, and it's this crazy adventure. And at one point in the story, she writes, they crash forward through the uneven landscape, Jeep rocking violently, and Gallagher, that's one of the researchers, and the media, that's her. She refers to herself as the media throughout this story. Oh, it's such a hilarious story. I love it. Trying to keep from slamming into one another in the back seat until they stuck, mired in a deep mud trench. Everyone ejects, and rocks are collected and thrown under the tires and into the muck ahead, and after a while the truck is dislodged. And then more crashing, and some very near tipping, and then they get stuck again. And this is just one of many, many kind of rollicking scenes in this story that really put you into the scene, and you get a sense of who these characters are, that they would choose to go to this place in the first place to look for a bird that they know does not exist. And it's such a fascinating story because you know that they didn't discover the ivory-billed woodpecker there, because had that happened, that would have been in the news long before this feature story came out. And so somehow you're on the hook. What's going to happen in this story, even though you know they did not find it? Such a good story.
So what makes it so good? Is it?
What makes the story so good?
Yeah.
First of all, it's packed with action like this. It is funny. Mac McClellan has a really, really funny voice. The characters are just wackadoodle characters, so they aren't regular people characters. They are pretty wacky. She is in conflict with the characters because they're putting her into so much danger. I have tried to dissect why do you feel this sense of tension and uncertainty and mystery when in fact you know that they don't find this bird. And I think the reason is that the central driving question of that story ostensibly is, will they find this bird? But it's not really. It's really, why would they do this, right? And that's what this story is really about. And so, in that list of some central driving questions that were like, what was that like? Another one would be, why would you do this? And I think that's the story that you're getting told. And it's really some fascinating answers to why you would do this. But read the story to find out. I said at the beginning that narrative is not an all or none thing. You do not have to have Henrietta Lacks to do narrative. So I just wanted to suggest 4 ways that we can weave narrative into stories. And in bigger ways and smaller ways. Sometimes it's just a 2-sentence anecdotal lead. Sometimes it's anecdotes elsewhere in the story that reveal character in some way, through actions, through scenic detail, through dialogue. little things. Susan, you do this all the time. You have your stories are just so full of voice and you know, bring characters to life, and you know, and they may not always have a narrative through line. Sometimes they're explanatory stories, but they have these narrative bits that just hook you and make you care about those characters. You can do that through little scenes that show how some process unfolds in a laboratory. You know, you can choose to dedicate an extra 50 words to describing the way that an experiment was done and doing that in a way that's interesting. Other times it's not going to be the most interesting way to do it, and it's not the main point, and you shouldn't do that. You can weave in narrative through little gestures and behaviors that show character in some way, and then again through sensory details that establish a mood. And that one of the things that does is that it helps bring us, the readers, into that story, so we feel like we're a little bit there, and less that we're being told a story remotely, and more that we're living it just a little bit. That's all I got.
When I thought about this talk, I thought, what is the best short-term narrative I have ever seen? And I realized it is written by this guy. And this is it. Right? Beginning, middle, end, action, a lot of action, a lot of action. Action movie. Of course, it is 6 words, maybe a little long, so you might prefer the shorter version. So, but you know, I'm an editor, right? And I've worked in news settings and feature settings and blah, blah, blah. And so if my writer filed this story with me, if Julius came in and said, hey man, here's my story, and I'm looking at this, I'm like, well, we got some problems here. So I came, okay, like, who came? Where did you come? Where is this happening? What's the scene? When did this happen? Why? Why did you come? I don't know. And how'd you get there? Chariot, whatever, right? So not a whole lot of information in that. I saw you got some of the same problems. I conquered. How'd you do it? Why'd you do it, right? Okay, so these are the problems you're going to confront, though, when you try to do short narrative, which is you have to pack all of this information into a very short kind of space, right? The other problem that science in particular has is that you may be familiar with these 2 wonderful shapes. So the one on the left, for those of you who deal with the research world, is your classic technical paper, right? So you got your background, you got your methods, you got your finding and discussion, and eventually, after many pages and much verbiage, you get to the point, right? You get to what it is we have now discovered. And the problem as writers, of course, is that we need to do the opposite. We need to have our lead, we need to get right to the point. What is it at the top, right? So classic journalism, we take these things and we turn them upside down. And, you know, okay, we'll give you a little background, we'll give you some findings, maybe a bit more. But the problem when you're doing it for this, right, is you're trying to take that, often if you have a story that's based in research and you want to create a narrative out of it, right, you're not going to be able to use that classic journalism news pyramid, right? Because your story's going to look like that. I'm sort of channeling my inner John McPhee there. And so this guy actually summed this up very nicely a few years ago. He is much out of favor because he was involved in a great deal of sexual harassment, but he got at this very nicely, right? Which is, what is the difference between writing your classic research paper story and trying to do a narrative, which is, you know, the inverted pyramid basically lets the readers off the hook. They know after they get off the past the first few paragraphs, they don't need to read on anymore. They've gotten or they can just read the headline if it's a good headline, right? Whereas a narrative, the writer is trusting you to stick with it a little bit because they're not going to tell you what the bottom line of the story is right off the bat. So what do you do? Right? So obviously there is no great Einsteinian solution here. You've got to do less of everything, right? So you're going to focus on the fewest number of characters possible. And Siri gave a great example of that, the doctor and the patient, right? 2-character story. That's probably the minimum you could get away with in that story. I would say you're going to have to stick to a chronological narrative. You're going to have to move from the past to the present. in some way, because almost any other kind of narrative you can think of is going to force the readers to go backwards or to do a lot of work, and also you're just not going to have the space to do that kind of thing. So you're probably just going to have to work forward. And one thing that's great about this is you, in written language and even in spoken language, you can compress time. You have your own little time machine that you can use. And so a lot of times when you read long narrative stories, there are these long chronological sections that basically twist and turn and carry you through time. When you're writing short, the way you get through those 1,700 words is you cut them all, and then you say, eventually, right? You just get rid of all that stuff that's so beautiful to read and do it because you don't have the space. So there are all these helper signposts that you can use that help you jump through time very quickly. The reader doesn't know what they missed, right? So you don't have to worry about that. As many people have already discussed, science stories lend themselves actually not only to narrative in general, but to these streamlined narratives, right? The quest, the mystery, the voyage of change. I went someplace, what I saw there changed me, I came back a different person, right? So, and the nice thing is these all are chronological narratives, beginning at the beginning. Why did it do the work? Why did they set off in the questioning voyage? What was the question? The middle is basically the method section of the paper, right? How'd they do it? What obstacles did they have to overcome on the way? And then the end, right? The hero scientist, Eureka, we found it. We solved the mystery. I now see the world in a very different way, right? So this is where structure, form, archetypes told stories can really help you. They can make your job a lot easier. And again, it's like music. You only have the same 8 notes to play with. So the trick is the craft comes in as few words as possible, being as elegant and clever and colorful as you can be. But you don't have to worry so much about the underlying structure of the archetype. Just use it. It works, as Laura said. These are formulas and they work. Every time you use it, you can make another $1 million, right? Kurt Vonnegut. Okay. Sometimes, however, you get really lucky. And I'm really sorry I was not able to find this story because I read it 30 years ago in a local paper, and I thought it was one of the most fantastic pieces of short narrative I had ever seen in my life. And this was a story written by a local, he wasn't even the sports writer, he was a general assignment reporter at this paper, and it was a story written about a softball game between 2 college softball teams. And I think they were playing to get into a tournament or maybe for the championship or something like that. The entire story was maybe 800 words long, maybe 900 words long, and the structure was as follows. The backbone of the story took place over 6 to 8 minutes. It was 6 pitches. Pitcher throws the first pitch, pitcher throws the second pitch, pitcher throws the third, and so forth. Wow. Total of 6 pitches, so you've got one narrative arc that lasts maybe 6 or 8 minutes. You have a second narrative arc that lasts 25 years. Pitcher throws the first pitch, then there's a step back, you meet the pitcher. Pitcher throws the second pitch, step back, you meet the batter. Pitcher throws the third pitch. How did these 2 characters end up at this place in this time? There's an obstacle and a complication. Turns out these 2 women went to high school together. They played on the same softball teams. They played on the same travel softball teams. They were 2 of the most highly recruited softball players at this particular tier of college. And they wanted to play together, but it turned out in the end, they got recruited by separate teams because one team already had enough pitchers, the other team already had enough batters, so they ended up on separate teams. And then lo and behold, they end up in this high stakes game, facing each other at a critical moment in the game, okay? Then there's the resolution, right? At pitch 6, something happens, right? So what happened in this particular case was the pitcher struck out the batter. And so it was a pivotal moment in the game. There's this tension leading up to it, which of these 2 women is going to prevail in this face-off. One of the women prevails. And then there's this resolution and happy ending, which the writer does not tell you until the end of the story that these women are married to twin brothers. And at the end of the game, they all go out for dinner. So, whoops. So, narrative structure, right? But again, 800 or 900 words, it was a great story. It had characters, it had scenes, it even has a little tiny bit of dialogue in this section here where they talked about, how disappointed they were that they were. So sometimes you just get lucky, but you can think about that narrative what I call these narrative backbones. Liz and I did a story together where there was a narrative backbone, where it was a woman chopping up a marine mammal, right? They're in this operating theater, they're hacking apart this marine mammal, and I think we had 3 or 4 scenes that went through the story, but it was the same scene. That narrative scene only took place over half an hour, 45 minutes. Then in between those scenes was a narrative arc that took place over like 40 years, because it was a profile of this woman and how she had come to this, how did she end up in this room hacking up this thing. So these are, you can really get into this. It's called braided narrative and blah, 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 but it doesn't matter. Sometimes short can even be fun. So years ago when I was working at NPR, I noticed this paper, I think it was in Science, I can't remember, and it was a paper about what was claimed to be, one of the shortest lived fish. And all I'm trying to do is highlight this. And so one of my reporters I worked with was Chris Joyce, and Chris is always up for some fun. So I went to Chris and I said, hey, there's this paper about a fish that lives 59 days. 59 days is about 60 seconds. What if we did a story where each second of the story was a day in the life of the fish? And Chris was like, yeah, that sounds like fun, let's try it. So this is what came out.
Now, the coral reef pygmy goby inhabits the Pacific Ocean. It lives at most 59 days. That's 2 weeks less than the previous vertebrate record holder, an African fish found in pools of rainwater. Life at this speed is frantic. At this point in our story, the goby is already halfway through its life. It's a late-stage larva looking for a home on a reef. It has the next 10 seconds to grow into a real fish and reach sexual maturity. Then the female has to lay eggs, about 400 in just 2 weeks. Eggs are tasty items on a reef menu, so the male spends most of its life hovering over them. Even so, less than 10% will survive. Writing in the journal Current Biology, scientists say this live fast, die young strategy is the only way to survive a perilous life. Live fast or die out, and that's all the time we have. Goodbye, pygmy goby.